This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
We shift our attention now, of course, to marking 60 years since Malcolm X had been assassinated today. His unwavering commitment to the liberation of his people set in motion a wave of black consciousness, inspiring oppressed people across the globe. His reversion to Islam also played a key role in understanding his duty towards his people and the importance of being committed to a worthy cause.
If I recall, I'm pointed out that while I was at Mecca, making the pilgrimage, I spoke about the brotherhood that existed at all levels and among all people who were there on that Hajj, who had accepted the religion of Islam. And perhaps it could drive some of the racism from this society as it has driven racism from the Muslim society.
That a very important point that he highlights there. That was Malcolm X or Malik al-Shabazz in a clip, of course, of very many years ago, in an interview following his return from the Hajj. Here now to discuss his legacy of this, particularly great man in a very important bit of our history. Let's welcome Cassiem Khan, a social justice activist. We're also waiting the arrival of Advocate Sipho Mantula, who's a researcher at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at Unisa. We'll talk to him once he so does join us. Let's kick off the conversation with Cassiem Khan, social justice activist. Assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam and shukran for having us, and Jummah Mubarak to all the listeners.
Malcolm X, of course, grew up in a time where the American society had its most starkest, obvious, in-your-face type of racism. It still suffers from a lot of that today, but not as in-your-face as it was then, because segregation was a particular feature of their lives, where there was a particular fight for that liberation, and Malcolm X at the center, certainly, of that particular effort. And so let's start to contextualize who Malcolm X was and why he was such a almost magnanimous figure in resisting that level of oppression.
Yes, indeed, Tashriq, Malcolm X was a towering figure, not just in the struggle against racism in the United States, but particularly in the late 50s and the early part of the 1960s, somebody whose words and actions impacted the entire world at the time. And if people are aware and can remember that the 1960s was also the period of intense anti-colonial activities across much of the marginalized world. And by marginalized world, I mean that part of the world that was colonized by particularly Western European countries across the world, so South America, Africa, and much of Asia. And the driving force of that, the pedestal on which that colonialism stood and the anti-colonialist struggled was the aspect of racism. So Tashriq, Malcolm X was relevant then, and is particularly relevant now because racism continues to exist. In fact, racism is thriving, and it has a new name, and it is becoming more clear and more specific to those people who are, particularly the majority world, who are impacted by that racism. And we now clearly start referring to it as white supremacism. And so white supremacists have now a champion in the highest and most strongest seat of government in the world today, and he is Donald Trump. He's by no means the only character that leads the charge of white supremacists in the world today. And so there may have been in the 1960s legislation that had enforced racism. But racism continues today because there is this belief of supremacy that many people continue to advance. And that is that if you are not white, you are clearly not on the right side, and that you are less than them. And because you are less than them, you don't deserve to have a voice. You don't particularly deserve to have any control of governments, and neither do you have control of land. And especially your own land. And so racism hasn't taken a backseat. It has maybe come off the books of legislatures across the world, but it is thriving. And one of the reasons that I believe it is thriving is because more and more people who have been oppressed, who continue to be oppressed, have identified who the oppressor is and is narrowing that space for them. And the oppressor is reacting in vile, disgusting, brutal ways in advancing their supremacy. In a belief that they are a better people, that they are better than them. And we, as Muslims, are taught about that first character in the Quran who said, when he did not bow down to Adam, he said, I am better than him. And so that is the origin of racism. That is the issue that makes Malcolm X particularly relevant. And what was specific about him and different about him is he spoke directly to that issue. He did not mince his words about it. And this is why people took to him.
Yeah, and it enveloped an entire civil society movement, that was increasingly, of course, also being pulled in different directions. And I'll come to that, the sort of passivism versus the active pursuit of freedom, as Malcolm X said, by the bullet or by the ballot. And so, let's now welcome Advocate Sipho Mantula, researcher at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at Unisa. Advocate Mantula, thank you very much for your time. What is the relevance of Malcolm X 60 years on since his death? We had, of course, Cassiem, that is our other speaker on the line, highlight how the relevance of Malcolm X today, as much as it was, 60 years plus ago. And the race relations certainly have taken a different turn, in that you have, for instance, a white supremacist in the White House at the moment that celebrates the American, or rather the support from the African community, the black community, and then, of course, he goes on to target those very communities together with, Latinos, Mexicans, etc., in a way that can only be described as being a racist attitude towards these groupings, and I'm then, wanting to understand whether, if one looks at Malcolm X's message 60 plus years ago, whether today perhaps there is a greater introspection that needs to be done to close the gap in some way or the other around, these almost polarizing issues that has come to confront our politics in our daily lives.
Tashrika, refreshing morning to your listeners, even to my brother Cassiem, for us to reflect on the 6 decades of the son of the soil, Malcolm X. When you look back at that, the 6 decades also, they are in line with, if you recall, in 2024, we look back also at the 60 years of the founding of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. A very important highlight after Malcolm X has done many visits to the African continent to understand the plight of Africans in the African continent, but also to understand the plight of Africans who were in the US. And as you have said, we know very well that Malcolm X was assassinated at a very young age, but it shows his thinking, his consciousness, that he was able to can amplify to the broader struggles that the Africans and the general people who were facing these issues that were in the US, coming from whether Marcus Garvey, you look at the issues like your Martin Luther King, but the Malcolm X character and the feature in the global social politics are relevant in the 21st century, are relevant even in the 2025 relations between the US and the African continent. So it is important for us to always reflect on the character of Malcolm X as a person who was searching for the black liberation by raising the lines like by any means necessary. And when you look at his role that Malcolm X has played in the broader continent of issues around identity, issues around racism, issues around hegemony that we have seen in the US against the Muslim community and as well as the African community. Hence, I am raising this issue that it is important to know that Malcolm X had a passion, had a commitment for the liberation of the African continent, and as well as the issues that are affecting the people of America, which was the black majority in most instances. So when we look at the legacy of Malcolm X, we should never shy away from even dealing with the geopolitics that we see in the Trump administration, and also when we look back at what has happened when those people who killed Malcolm X, they were later convicted, others were sentenced, and they were released. So there is a lot of a complexity when you look at the assassination of Malcolm X. What were the push and the pull factors, but also his initiative to unite the Africans who were in the US with the Africans who were in the African continent.
And I mean, there's so many bits of, I suppose, pearls of wisdom that one can cherry pick today to understand the complexity of world politics and situations that we find ourselves in, Cassiem. One of them reminds me of Malcolm X's description of the media, saying they have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that's power because they control the minds of the masses. While there may be very many truths therein, and we saw, during the 15 months of a genocide in Gaza, how that was increasingly difficult to maintain, the sort of power that the media has over the minds. But there is, again, if one takes a look 60 years ago to where we are right now, it seems that the practice of seeking to control the narrative around who the oppressed is and who happens to be the ones that is fighting for liberation, that oftentimes get labeled all manner of things, that what Malcolm X said was true then as much as it is true now.
Yeah, well, there's a simple answer to that. When power hates you, when power seeks to imprison and torture and then, of course, assassinate you, and then want to eliminate your history, then clearly you are the one who are on the right path. And so anyone that particularly follows the advice and words and teachings of a leader such as Malcolm X would know that the oppressor will do absolutely everything to divide the oppressed. And I think what we learn and particularly take from Malcolm X and why his words matter to us, that particular saying also, is that many people who claim to engage in some sort of social activism, some sort of public life, some sort of politics of some sort, whatever, the genuine ones know and are guided by political principles. The ones that are not so sure, and I want to be kind and generous to them and say that they have not found the light yet. They operate on political expediency. So the moment there's any type of pressure on them and so forth, they then come up with all sorts of solutions that at the end of the day is all about their self-preservation. Now, one of the things that I liked about when Malcolm X was asked, of course, by the media, like, are you not afraid? He said, no, I died 20 years ago already. I have already committed myself and I know that I will be killed. You understand? So here's a man, and I dare say now somebody who has been given the honor of living longer than 39 years, that Malcolm X, who died at 39 years of age, had done more in his short space of life to be able to teach us these political principles. And so what are these political principles? The principles are things that we say in Afrikaans, beginsels, something that you start with, that is foundational, that you will not compromise on. And so your ability to be able to see the media, as to use your example, which at times and in most cases, in our experience, are instruments of political power. media does not necessarily have to be like that. And I think as a complement to Radio 786, it has shown that it does not have to stand in favor of and on the side of those who control and have political power, but be a base and be an opportunity for the voiceless to raise their voices. So clearly, Malcolm X has taught us many things in being able to, based on political principle, identify where power lies.
Yeah.
And the oppressed are oppressed by virtue of the fact that power has been denied to them.
And Advocate Sipho, the fact that Malcolm was seen for some to be divisive and for others a liberator. There was, of course, high drama with Elijah and, the Nation of Islam movement and the different civil rights movements that existed at the time in trying to navigate America into a direction, of course, that was seeking to attain freedom, but sometimes in a way that isn't quite passive, and again, there's so many quotes that one can cherry pick, but the one, of course, that stands out for me was that when Malcolm said, I'm for truth no matter who tells it, I'm for justice no matter who it's for or against, or when, of course, he went on to say that I am for violence if non-violence means we continue postponing a solution to the American black man's problem just to avoid violence. And while I by no means, suggesting that violence ought to have been the way that the fight for liberation for the black man, played itself out in the United States, that should have been the way to go. The sense here is that if one applies that moment in time to our current political discourse in the world, as it were, there seems to be, such a difficult paradigm to understand the way in which freedom must be attained. What is the best appropriate approach to be able to do so? Because clearly, had it not been, for instance, even if one looks at the South African example, had there not been members of the ANC and PAC to go into the camps, to go and train, to seek an armed rebellion against the white supremacist apartheid government, they would not have been forced to the negotiating table, much like we see, of course, in Palestine as well. And there's been this effort to demonize those that are fighters for liberation in the way that, the oppressor only understands how. So let's maybe root that example in trying to understand really the difficult period that Malcolm X is finding himself in trying to advance the liberation of the black man.
Tarshika, what you are raising and what Cassiem has raised also, it is his firm commitment into the struggle of a black man and of the Muslim Brotherhood that he has shaped his political induction or initiation, but also the same stage he was made at on this day 6 years ago is the same stage that he spoke in 1964 about those issues that we have raised of equality, of freedom, of justice, that how he was able to can gather around these three principles of freedom, equality, and justice, that he looked at that he was already facing the threat within the organization. He was also facing the threat from the then American CIA operatives. He was also gaining traction with his visit to Egypt, Nigeria, and ultimately to be in the Ethiopian meeting of the Organization of African Unity when he visited the OAU summit to go and launch some of his political philosophies and his views and his principles to liberate the black man in the USA. And as we have said, one of the issues that has also come out is the misrepresentation of how people viewed Malcolm X as a person who was divisive, disruptive. But if you look at his contribution in the global struggles of the Pan-Africanist movement, the Black consciousness movement, it has been that of understanding that the black man has been undermined from the beginning of enslavement, when there was Mafa, what we call Mafa, or slavery, when the enslavement began. The issue even of the identity of a black man, as I've alluded on my intro, It goes back to the current geopolitics of the last stage of imperialism that we see, of the neocolonialism that comes from the superpowers like the USA. You look at France, you look at the EU, how they view the philosophies of black leaders like Malcolm X, leaders like Patrice Lumumba, leaders like Julius Nyerere and Nkrumah. One will also have to appreciate how we view the contribution of people like Malcolm X, who was also working with many leaders, who was also working with his family in the struggle. It is very rare when a great leader passed on. We hardly talk about his family and how his family was also inclined to his commitment and to his conviction to liberate the black man. So it is very important, as we are doing a 6-decade commemoration and the 6 decades of reviewing the impact that Malcolm X has left in the geopolitics of the African continent as well as the African diaspora. So it's very important when we have to navigate and position the knowledge that Malcolm X was able to bring, and even how his teachings are still relevant, as you were raising even the issue of how the media also, the question also of looking at his sense of that an African who hates himself is the African who also hates the African continent. Very important when he has to affirm our allegiance to the struggles of the African continent, whether it's the conflict in Sudan, whether it's a conflict in the Eastern DRC, whether it's a conflict in the Middle East, as you have alluded, that these were the struggles that philosophers and black activists like Malcolm X were able to agitate and to stand for.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that I think it was at the end of 2023 that there was Cassiem, 2 men that was convicted for the killing of Malcolm X, that was exonerated. Something like 20, 30 years after, he is dead. They spent 20 years in prison. They've been exonerated because it would appear that the investigation did not fully determine them to have been the assassins of Malcolm X and what the conspiracy was behind his murder. It's now known that the prosecutors at the time and others withheld certain bits of very important information about those that may have been behind Malcolm X's assassination. I want to not take away from that moment, but relate it to our, let's call him our own Malcolm X version, of that, and that is in the form of Chris Hani, in which we look at this issue around Clive W. Lewis and some of the others that, were seen to be the gunmen, but the handlers we don't certainly know of, and whether there was a deliberate effort to take out what could have been the shapers of a liberation movement, a liberation movement that would attain freedom in a way that chips away from the white man's control over people's freedom, liberties, and so on. What sort of lessons do we learn from, the way in which the Malcolm X murder trial was handled, together with, the observations we make around Chris Hani here in South Africa?
Yeah, okay, let us first start by a slight step back. You see, the whole idea of taking out a charismatic, principled political leader is because you fear their message. And the idea that you will end their message, in their influence by the assassination, is something that oppressors over the centuries have not learned. And I don't think they will ever learn that. So Chris Hani continues to live in the hearts of the oppressed masses, and Malcolm X continued to live and inspire millions of people. I mean, if we just see the Black Lives Matter movement, if we think about how the apartheid state wanted to bury the idea of not just the idea of just the name Sobukwe, and how the Fees Must Fall movement elevated it to heights unbelievable. And so the oppressor is defeated in that attempt at assassination. But let us also understand that every country has a deep state. And the deep state are the characters who are not elected, who decide that they hold the future of any particular society in place, and they are the ones who sit with the answers. And so there is the ability to be able to say, well, somebody knows. I am absolutely certain that in most political assassinations, there is always a greater story that is untold. And so the question is, does that guide us in our day-to-day activity? So many people who are on the rise, who are guiding communities, things like that. Imagine if they must all think about, well, what if I get killed? I am upsetting certain things or whatever. And I think what is more important for us is that we defeat that deep state by continuing to elevate these characters, these particular political leaders. Having said all of that, you know what is interesting about, and I encourage listeners to look at that, and it's on YouTube, Who Killed Malcolm X, and the manner in which the investigations are done. And this is, again, one of the interesting things, and I'm sure there will be opportunities to review the killing of Chris Hani even in this country, is how the future sometimes holds the answers that the past wanted to hide. And so you find that, for example, modern technology, how information was stored, all of these things tend to give answers to how exactly what happened. You know, sometimes something is so obvious in that moment that we think we had all the answers. We heard now from the assassin of Chris Hani that he just went out to scout for the opportunity, and when he saw him, he just took the opportunity and just killed our great leader. The point that we are making is that, yes, there was some clearly people that were upset by Chris Hani. But if we spend so much time in trying to identify them, and they will be exposed, that is one of the definites about the truth. The truth it will prevail. It will always prevail. If it does not happen in 60 years, now you do know, of course, that Malcolm X's family has now sued the FBI, the CIA, the New York Police Department, all of those things, and are applying pressure. And people today may not be as keen as wanting to keep information hidden. And one of the reasons that they do that is also because the actual perpetrators are long gone. And we have learned this particularly in our exposure, in my exposure to cases where apartheid era leaders were killed. And as soon as the perpetrators are dead, then all the information just suddenly appears. And so that will appear. So the point is, there may be a greater conspiracy. It is how we respond to that conspiracy until that information is present. So when certain political leaders who may have been involved die, well, maybe the truth will come out then. The point about it is that what do we do in the intervening time? And in that time, especially, and I'm really particularly grateful to Radio 786 for reminding us about Malcolm X today. Malcolm X will live much, much longer than the people who set out to silence him. They clearly failed.
And so, with your last remarks as well, Advocate Sipho Mantula, I want to maybe look at this legacy of Malcolm X a little bit more broadly, and not to invoke the tensions that were between himself and Elijah Muhammad, but, when he spoke about Elijah Muhammad, one of the elements that he took a very sharp disagreement with Elijah Muhammad on was, these integration laws that were being spoken about in America at the time. Much like, there were these guys here in South Africa that wanted support for the tricameral parliament. It amazes me how history just keeps on repeating itself in different forms and shapes. But nonetheless, that's besides the point that I'm trying to make here. That what Malcolm X said was that, you are forcing white people to pretend as if though they are accepting black people as their equal, because they are not. And what instead you are doing is exposing white people in a hypocritical way. How much of that very seminal moment in saying this is not what freedom looks like, true freedom comes, as he says it, either by the bullet or by the ballot, right? That that the superficial freedom, that is accorded to black people, one can look at it from a macroeconomic perspective as well, and the fact that, in the broad sense, African black people today remain, in the far majority, the menial workers, the cleaners, the shopkeepers, etc. They don't own the means of production, as it were. What sort of lessons do we infer and learn here from Malcolm X, taking a principled stand to say, we are for freedom for everyone and everywhere, but not in a superficial way?
Absolutely, Chashu. One thing that we must pick up, and I think Cassiem is correct when he was talking about this assassination file, how the truth will still come out. I was thinking of how Samora Machel was killed, how Lumumba was killed, and how many more of our leaders have been killed. And within them, you have what will say your best friend will become your worst enemy. But when you look at how Malcolm X, when he moved out from the split of the Nation of Islam and subsequently forming the Organization of Afro-American Unity, he has already turned enemies. There were already enemies that were created with that move. But you look at his differences with Martin Luther King also on how to reboot and rearrange the system, that Malcolm X was of the view that it's not to change the system or be part of the system, but to dismantle the system, disrupt the system. So the thinking of Malcolm X, as you have said, that what we can learn from him was that he was very clear on the question of how Africans should view their struggles and the issues that he was also being seen to be violent or radical and militant. It was based on that colonialism and neo-colonialism, they were never done in a very non-violent way. They were violently being perpetuated and perpetrated against the black people. So it was important for him also to view the issues of what he said. It was important to understand what he called a violent and systematic oppression that black Americans faced in the US. And when he also had to grapple and understand the African conflicts also during those eras of the late 60s, he could understand that the same plight that the black Americans were going through, it is the same plight that the Africans in the African continent, they were going through also. So it is important when you look at his views also was how he didn't want to become what we'll say a moderate or at the same time a very reconcilable person, when he thought, as I said, those principles of freedom, equality, and as well as justice that he was searching for, he was not able to get. Hence, his assassination was also orchestrated and conspired within his members of his movement. So that's how it is very important to look that Malcolm X was a threat to the global system. He was a threat to the establishment of that time in the late 60s. And also when you look at the 21st century, we see many threats to many leaders. If you look at the Sahel region, your Traores, your Assimi Goïta. So you see that threat also coming from many young leaders in the African continent who wants to raise the issue of the relation between the colonized and the colonizer. Because that's how Malcolm also was able to depict. He was able to isolate his enemy also from his friends. And that's how it was important for us to look at the attempt assassination that he has also went through. Because we must recall that this assassination of this day, 60 years ago, it was premeditated all along, that Malcolm was already a threat. The same like I have raised the issue of Marcus Garvey and other Pan-Africanist leaders who were standing on this question.
Advocate Sipho Mantula, thank you very much for your time, my brother. Always appreciate talking to you. Cassiem, if you're still on the line, actually just one final question for you. I think I don't want to lose the moment of marking 60 years of Malcolm X's death and his assassination. Without, of course, reflecting on his Islam as a political ideology, but also one in which he practiced, right? He makes the point, Malcolm X makes the point to say in the Bible, God offered Pharaoh freedom, or Pharaoh freedom, if he would just let the oppressed people free to go to the land of milk and honey, but Pharaoh disobeyed and he was later destroyed. I want to dovetail it with Malcolm X saying that there's nothing in our book, the Quran, that teaches us to suffer peacefully. Our religion teaches us to be intelligent. I want to pick up on that point, and maybe as a way to drive home a message on this day, as a point of introspection for the Muslim community that too from time to time suffers this dissonance of some sort about what Islam says about the establishment of equality and a just society, and one that of course demands of you to read and to be intelligent, etc., but also to fundamentally deal with the racism that does exist within pockets of our community. Islam doesn't certainly profess or in any way allow for racism to exist, but it is Muslims, pockets of them at least, that do suffer from this and don't quite see the black man sometimes as their equal. How do we, in reverence of Malcolm X and marking this anniversary, remind ourselves not just about his legacy, but fundamentally part of that legacy that is premised on Malcolm X's reversion to Islam and his reliance on the Quran as a constitution by which, of course, he sought that freedom?
Thank you very much for this question, Tashri. I think you raise a number of issues that needs to be addressed, but let us deal with the intellect first. I was thinking about how we acquire information, how we acquire knowledge, and inshallah also how we acquire wisdom in what we profess. And so one of the things and I'm sure many of the listeners and even myself, we are guilty of this, that we spend hours doom scrolling. We spend hours on being part of and involved in all sorts of WhatsApp groups where we do not verify whatever this information that we are gathering, that it is actually the truth. And so my advice to our listeners and to myself is that we need to revive our halaqat, our ideological classes, our reading groups, in which we individually and as part of the group read and we reflect on what it is that we are reading. So we are taking back that time from doom scrolling. We are taking back that time from all the WhatsApp groups that we are involved in, that many times are just spreading information that is not necessarily the truth. And so that's the first action that I would want us particularly to focus on. And in those halakat, in those halakat, for somebody who doesn't understand that, is these are just the Arabic word for a study group. And in the format of the study groups or the halakat that we used to participate in the 1980s, there were 3 or 4 aspects that we would cover. We'd cover Quranic verses, ahadith, we'd cover aspects of history, and then we'd cover an aspect on current events. Now, when we sit together with each other, coming to the group to learn, to read, to reflect, to discuss, it is vastly different from acquiring that information that we got just from some person infiltrating a WhatsApp group and telling you how concerned they are about the future of South Africa with deep racial undertones. And many people are now completely relying on social media for their information. Now, I'm not saying social media is a bad thing, but come together in your groups, express what your thoughts are. Be corrected by your brother and sister with whom you are sitting in these groups to be able to say, you know what, say those things that you believe but are uncomfortable. So many people have challenges, for example, that they don't like to employ local people. They prefer employing foreigners. Okay, what's the reason? And so these are the different ways in which this racism actually manifests itself. But you are not going to change by just sitting with your phone. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is that, yes, racism will continue. And you know what? Many people, it doesn't matter who it is that is the leader or the teacher that brings them that. If they are not prepared to challenge that which is within themselves, the views and values that they hold. It doesn't matter that color of that leader, because you know what? Somebody will look at the most beautiful person that was ever created, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and when they see how he sat with the slaves and with the poorest of the poor, they will look down on him. They will say like, "What can this guy give us?" You understand? Because if I'm a person of stature and importance and things like that. And so these are the ways we need to confront the racism that we have within us. And a day such as today is a great opportunity for us to be able to reflect. And I want to end by Tashriq saying, I am wondering at which masjid across South Africa, let alone the world, today will there be a khutbah dedicated to, if not the subject of Malcolm X, then on the subject of racism. And I hope that whatever we are sharing in this subject that we are opening can be considered at least some form of advice that we are giving, if it did not come from the mimbar today.
Thank you very much, Cassiem, there for having joined us as well this morning. Cassiem Khan, a social justice activist, and Advocate Sipho Mantula, researcher at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at the University of South Africa, Unisa.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.